It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. It's the return of Roger Corman this week as we look at The Pit and the Pendulum. This was during the era in which Roger Corman was putting out a handful of movies loosely based on the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Between 1960's House of Usher and 1965's The Tomb of Ligeia, Corman directed no fewer than 7 films that adapted concepts or ideas created by Poe. 6 of them, including this week's feature, starred Vincent Price. But the story of the development of this movie actually begins the year before with House of Usher. You see, Corman's adaptation of House of Usher was a fairly decent box office hit. This surprised producers James H. Nicholson and Samuel Z. Arkoff at American International Pictures. The expectation was that the movie would do well, but nowhere near how well it ultimately did. So Nicholson and Arkoff wanted another movie with a Poe title, and they wanted it pretty quickly. Richard Matheson, who wrote several of the Poe movies, including House of Usher, even said that AIP had no intention of having an established franchise of Poe movies. They just wanted the titles to sell the movies. So that allowed Matheson to create whatever story he really wanted, while still loosely tying things back to the original short story that this movie is based on. And he created this fairly elaborate plot while trying to keep the climax as close as he could to the original Poe stuff. Now, he wanted to include a scene that was a flashback that kind of helped create some story around the characters that the characters of Vincent Price's Nicholas and Barbara Steele's Elizabeth. But Corman ultimately would nix this because Corman had a series of major theories regarding his Poe tales. The flashback scene would have violated one of them. You see, Corman wanted these movies to exist as if they were coming from Poe's subconscious, if you will. So these movies were not allowed to depict anything that would be perceived to be reality in the confines of the plot. So he didn't want to include a scene that involved some characters from the movie in broad daylight. Everything we see in this movie either happens at dusk or at nighttime. You don't see a sunny day in this movie. Vincent Price himself would also suggest several changes to his dialogue during filming, further editing and changing Matheson's original finished script. Now, the film would go on to be an even bigger hit than House of Usher and would eventually become AIP's biggest Edgar Allan Poe hit of them all at the box office. The film would go on to influence Italian cinema for decades. Even Stephen King points to a big twist in this movie that had a huge impact on horror as a genre and would end up being one of the most powerful films in the genre of the 1960s. And so, you can really kind of understand when you see like a lot of Matheson's twists that play out in this movie. Yeah, absolutely. This would go on to influence Italian cinema for the next 20 years after this. Hell, maybe even 30 years after this. But let's get into it so we can really kind of unpack this pretty detailed plot. So it's the mid-1500s. It's also Spain. This means we're in the midst of the Spanish Inquisition, which is kind of only mentioned at first, and it kind of plays in the background of this movie, but ultimately ends up becoming a fairly major element to what this story is all about. We meet Francis Bernard, who has arrived from England to visit the castle belonging to his brother-in-law, Nicholas Medina. Now, he wants to know what has happened to his sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth has died under mysterious circumstances, and he wants to see Don Medina, and the Don's servant, Maximilian, tries to shoo him away, but Catherine, Nicholas's younger sister, comes to the door and allows him in, but she doesn't really allow Francis to see Nicholas. She says that he's resting. So Francis instead asks to visit Elizabeth's grave, but Catherine says there is no grave. Instead, she was interned, as is custom in the Medina family. So she leads him down to the cobweb-filled cellar and into the catacombs underneath the castle, and he hears this terribly grinding sound and discovers that Nicholas, who was not resting, as Catherine said he was, coming out of this room. And Nicholas is kind of peculiar, but not entirely inhospitable to his brother-in-law from England. Nicholas tells Francis that it was, quote, something in her blood, unquote, that led to Elizabeth's death. Francis is not so satisfied with that answer. Now, Nicholas shows Francis Elizabeth's room and tells him that he is completely and totally sympathetic to Francis's distrust over Elizabeth's fate. And he tells Francis that his pain over the loss of his wife really kind of prevented him from really being able to contact Francis about his sister after several months since her passing. So when he talks about how much he loves Elizabeth, he breaks down in grief. And later during dinner, Nicholas's friend, Dr. Leon, arrives, and he was the one who diagnosed Elizabeth's illness. Now, Dr. Leon tells Francis that she didn't actually die of something in her blood, but it was from a terrible shock. Something frightened her so deeply that she died of that thing that scared her. And I assume it ended up being something that we would refer to as like a heart attack in more modern times. But apparently she found the torture chamber of Nicholas's father, Sebastian Medina, one of the most notorious members of the Spanish Inquisition. And she became obsessed with the torture chamber, and she ultimately would lock herself inside the Iron Maiden. And it freaked her out so much so that that's what led to her shock that would be her demise. And supposedly, before dying, she whispered Sebastian. Now, Francis doesn't really believe all of this that Nicholas has told him, but he tells Catherine that he really does seemingly feel as though Nicholas has guilt over Elizabeth's death. So Catherine reveals a story about how Nicholas witnessed their father killing their uncle for adultery and then torturing their mother for her role in this debauchery, indicating that, Sebastian discovered that his wife and his brother were having an affair. Now, later that night, Dr. Leon, Catherine, Francis, and the maid Maria are awoken by the sound of a harpsichord playing in the house. Now, it likely can't be Nicholas because he does not know how to play the instrument. And when they find Nicholas, he said that it had to be Elizabeth. And they go into the room with the harpsichord and find that the room is completely empty with all the windows locked. So there wasn't any way for somebody to come and go out the window because the windows were locked from the inside. Now, on the keys of the harpsichord is a ring that belonged to Elizabeth. Now, Dr. Leon tells Catherine and Francis that Nicholas believes that Elizabeth was prematurely interned. And however, Dr. Leon says that's just absolutely not possible. And he also reveals the truth about Nicholas and Catherine's mother's fate. She was not tortured to death, but she was indeed tortured. She was tortured and then interred alive. And that has given Nicholas this lifelong fear, almost like a PTSD of the same fate being repeated. And Dr. Leon says that with certainty that if Elizabeth Medina walks the halls of this castle, she does so in spirit, not as a living person. The next day, Maria was cleaning Elizabeth's room when she is told by Elizabeth herself to leave the room. Now, Nicholas then locks Elizabeth's room's door and says that no one will ever enter the room ever again. But as continued strange occurrences continue, including the slashing of a painting of Elizabeth, Francis continues to investigate, discovering that there's a secret passage between Nicholas and Elizabeth's rooms in the castle. So Francis accuses Nicholas of staging everything as a hoax. The accusation even leads to Nicholas starting to believe that maybe he is doing this out of some sense of insane guilt. And Dr. Leon then proclaims that they will open Elizabeth's tomb to prove that she is indeed dead. And when they open her tomb, and then her sarcophagus, the body of Elizabeth is distorted in a way that looked like she died in the tomb and not before being interred. So this drives Nicholas to the brink of insanity, believing that he himself killed his wife by having her placed into the sarcophagus and then put into her tomb. And Francis now feels total sympathy for his brother-in-law, because he now sees his sister's death was indeed accidental. There is no foul play as he originally suspected. Now that night, Nicholas hears Elizabeth's voice calling to him, and it leads him into the tombs and the catacombs, where he sees the sarcophagus open and Elizabeth rise out of it with bloodied hands. Now I should also say that Elizabeth is played by the fantastic Barbara Steele, who was one of the all-time great actresses in horror during the 60s. She's one who is both pretty, but also could be seen as a wife or protagonist, but also potentially haunting and even evil. She's fantastically used in this movie as Elizabeth. But anyway, she kind of slowly follows and chases Nicholas in the cellar or down in the catacombs, whatever it is. It's a cellar. I call it a cellar. It's also probably a catacombs. It's probably also like a dungeon. I don't know. Whatever it is, it's under the castle. But he eventually collapses to the floor and begins laughing uncontrollably until he goes catatonic. And Dr. Leon comes in and says that his brain has essentially broken, and thus reveals the real plot of the movie. Elizabeth and Dr. Leon were in cahoots to drive Nicholas insane so that they could ultimately be together. But unfortunately, she acted in this final move too early because Francis is still present. Now, he is leaving in the morning, but this is adding a little bit of a reason for Francis to stick around. Also, what are they going to do about Catherine? She's around. There's a lot that is probably not exactly well thought out, but she begins to gloat over Nicholas's seemingly catatonic body, but he stands up and starts acting like his father, Sebastian, even referring to her as Sebastian's wife's name. And he's going to get revenge on Dr. Leon and Elizabeth as if he's playing out that thing that he saw as a child when Sebastian killed his brother and his wife. So he forces Elizabeth into the Iron Maiden while having her mouth basically gagged, while Dr. Leon attempts to escape the torture chamber. And all this leads to Francis ultimately going into the catacombs after hearing all of this commotion. And Dr. Leon ultimately falls to his death. But when Francis calls out to Nicholas, he's knocked out and put under the killer pendulum blade that was Sebastian Medina's greatest torture device. The blade, with each swing by fractions of an inch, gets closer and closer to the victim that is tied below it. Now, realizing what's going on, Catherine gets Maximilian, the servant's help, to break into the torture chamber. Maximilian and Nicholas wrestle until Nicholas falls into the other part of the title that is also in the same chamber, the pit. And then Maximilian and Catherine stops the pendulum, and frees Francis, and they all leave the chamber, with Catherine saying that no one will ever again come into the catacombs. And so she locks the door behind them, with that proclamation that it won't ever be opened again. But unfortunately, they do not realize that the still living and gagged Elizabeth watched from the Iron Maiden, helpless to leave the chamber herself. And now for three things I like about 1961's The Pit and the Pendulum. First, I love the setting of where this castle of Don Medina is. On one side, the castle faces a cliff looking over the sea, and there's constant lightning and thunder and waves crashing against that cliff. But on the other side, the door faces a spooky-ass dead forest full of fog. I love stuff like this. And I mean, it's a staple of sorts in this period of Corman's career. The same general outdoor setting was used for The Raven and The Terror, as well as The Pit and the Pendulum. The interior is another great piece of atmosphere too. The castle is cavernous. There is kind of this cold, almost lifeless element to it, while it's also inhabited by people full of life. That the catacombs are full of cobwebs, with a secret room with an apparatus that makes a terrible grinding noise, which is obviously the pendulum. It doesn't take Nicholas claiming that he's haunted by Elizabeth for me to believe that this place would indeed have a ghost. I mean, you can really tell that Corman was dead set wanting to make these Poe films as highly produced and as well dressed as absolutely possible. And to be honest with you, this is one of the best looking horror films of the 60s. And by far and away, this is one of the best looking Corman films too. And honestly, I think this probably is Roger Corman's best film he ever made. Now next, I really like the performances by Vincent Price as Nicholas Medina and John Kerr as Francis. Price is absolutely playing a broken man who really is mourning what he believes is his dead wife, while also being driven completely insane because of what he feels his role was in his wife's death. While he is kind of a strange guy thanks to the actions of his father, he really is sad and broken. And by the time you realize what the reveal of the whole plot is, you do kind of feel for the guy. I mean, he is driven insane, which forces him into reenacting the thing that has been kind of haunting him his whole life. But on the other side of this, you have a very good John Kerr playing a headstrong, almost investigative police-like role, trying to get to the bottom of the mystery of what happened to his sister. He's just as much in the dark and unaware of the plot as Nicholas. But he's sympathetic too, because this guy is the, supposedly deceased woman's brother. So they do play well off of each other. And there are times where they kind of orbit each other in a way that, or at least they orbit around the same central point of, and at times they are close to each other, feeling that, oh, there is sympathy to be had for Nicholas. And then they kind of bounce off of each other to the point where Francis begins to think that Nicholas is really at fault for something, and he's kind of playing this elaborate hoax on everybody. But, they not only do they play well off of each other that way, but you ultimately have nothing to really dislike either character for. Now, granted, yes, Nicholas does become quite villainous in the end, but you kind of, again, this is the breaking point of his psyche. It's all of that past trauma coming in and kind of taking over. But frankly, all of the performances are pretty top notch in this. You have Luana Anders as Catherine. She's quite good in this. She would go on to have a really great career, having roles in several Jack Nicholson movies, because again, Nicholson came out of the Corman stable. And she would appear in movies like Easy Rider and The Last Detail. She was a very, very central point in Francis Ford Coppola's Dementia 13. But she's really good as Catherine. And, she's a totally innocent player in all of the shenanigans going on here. She's not party to any of those shenanigans. And you never really even suspect or given any reason to suspect her as part of anything. So I like all of the characters and the performances, particularly from those three main characters. Third, while some might think that Matheson's plot is a little too convoluted in parts, I actually think it's quite good and intriguing as a mystery. This is much more a mystery than a horror movie or anything else. I mean, it's not really a ghost story. It's a mystery that could lead to a ghost story. But, so it's hard to really, it's at times hard to really understand exactly what is factual and who has the entire story until it ultimately plays out. Catherine only has one version of her brother's scarred childhood, while Dr. Leon knows another version that's much more accurate. There are twists and turns that actually kind of make sense in the grand scheme of everything. And in the final 15 minutes, the whole thing turns upside down too. And when we originally thought Nicholas to be a scheming villain, he actually, wasn't. And he's actually a sympathetic guy, but then he starts to seek out revenge by embodying his actual villainous father. I mean, this is actually a pretty fun plot and story and it uses these twists and turns very well. Richard Matheson was a really good writer, and he was particularly adept at telling a story that was compelling. And it's on pretty good display in this movie by making it an engaging and engrossing story. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky to get all of our updates when episodes drop. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast as well as the Monster Monday show at your favorite podcast providers. And we also upload this stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we go overseas with a set of popular TV sitcom characters as a creepy family visits England in Munster Go Home. And until next week, stay spooky.